Hello, and welcome to another episode of Sunday Funday.
Fuck off, asshole! Leave me alone! Don't you know it's fucking Sunday?
Love it. So, we're going to go a little bit deeper this time. We're going to learn about a couple of really important concepts about the way signals are routed. Specifically two different types of signals, audio signals and modulation signals. So I'm going to load up what looks like a relatively simple patch. That sounds cool. Cool. I think that'll work. So, what I would like to do is kind of dig into how, basically, how you can look at the way the audio signals in this particular instrument are routed and the way the modulation signals are routed and the difference between the two, in case you aren't already familiar with that. It's a very basic concept, but understanding that concept will help you out tremendously in learning any sort of synth that is already wired up beneath the board, or something like a modular synth or something like this that you have access to actually modify the way things are routed. So what I'm going to do is first just look at what this instrument is. It is, again, the Monarch Micro. So nothing fancy. It is a miniature version of a Mini Moog. And what I can do is open up the structure view and make it a little bit wider here, so that we can actually dive into taking a look at how the audio signals are routed and the modulation signals. So I'm going to do a little bit of kind of spreading some of these things out just for my own reference and ability to understand what is going to what and what the final sort of output or I guess signal path would be. That's the best way to describe it, signal path, because there's many different signal paths happening at one time. And what you're hearing is the result of the audio signal path. And obviously the audio signal path, when you press a key, you have the envelope that controls its shape over time and ability to turn on and off when you want it to. So it's set to a way that's very responsive right now, and that's fine. The two really important modules to look at for creating audio signal are what's called the oscillators, and they're basically the two modules that are responsible for creating a sound that you would hear. So this sound is actually coming from this source. You could consider these sound sources. Normally when you're looking at hardware modular synthesizers, these are typically the more expensive of the modules because these are the ones that actually create sound. Now this is pretty important as well, because this utility note in module actually tells the oscillator when to fire, right? And it also is sending signals to an envelope, which is controlling the amplifier all the way at the end. And that is basically telling it to behave over time in response to this envelope. So you see the signal is routed to modulation input A, and and it is very responsive according to the envelope here, and it's basically turning on and turning off right when I want it to. So these two modules create the sound, and they're basically routed into the mixer. And then something like this is considered more of a modifier, or a modulation signal creator. Okay, so this is also responding to what's called the gate, which is essentially the information about when I put my finger on a key and when I take my finger off a key, right? And like there's obvious information in here that is telling the synthesizer what pitch I am hitting, but there's also the information that you wouldn't really think about unless you know about this stuff or have learned about this stuff, which is basically the information that is when you press a key and when you take your finger off of it. That's information in and of itself, and that information is sent to the envelope, and that tells the envelope according to this level of attack. In other words, how fast it will respond to that signal, this level of decay, or the duration of that decay stage of the envelope. So basically the duration of time that it sits there and decays, and then the sustain as well, which is the duration of time at the top of the envelope where it sustains prior to it decaying. So there's other switches and things here as well, but that information is able to be modulated, where if you wanted to create something that basically sent out different signals to different parts of the synthesizer, you could route it in whatever way you want. So I was speaking about, it looks like I was mistaken. I was speaking about this envelope as being the modulation envelope for the amplifier, and it looks like this is the one that is the modulation for the amplifier, and it's labeled pretty appropriately VCA, so that you understand this is the one that's actually controlling the duration of the signal over time, right? And to kind of demo that, I wonder if I can just kind of play with these, and you can kind of see that. You see, now it's more or less just sustaining. In different ways because I'm playing with this, right? So it's basically responding to how I'm setting it here, and that is controlling this VCA. You can see this modulation A input is actually controlling this knob without you having to put your hand on this knob. So normally you would have to put your hand on this knob and say, you would have to do something like that to control it with your hand. But this envelope is actually controlling it for you. And the only thing it needs to do that is it needs a gate signal from the utility note in. So once you have the utility note set up here, you're basically passing gate signals to the various modulation sources that you have in here. So using envelopes as modulation sources is very useful because you can actually tell this to then modulate different parts of the synth based on its response to your pressing the keyboard or not pressing the keyboard. And also having something that's separate from the VCA envelope is useful as well, because then you can just have a second one, and it's can be set up differently than how this one's set up. So cool stuff. And that's kind of a different signal path in and of itself. So these signal paths that you see coming out of here our modulation signal paths. You see, it's all going to what looks like modulation input A and modulation input B in some cases, but mostly modulation input A. And the mod wheel is going to, it looks like that's what that is. The mod wheel is going to modulation input B. So there's various cables that are dragged out from the mod wheel, and you can just click on them and highlight them and see where they're going to there. So that's useful to know, because as you're navigating the front panel then you could basically click on modulation sources A or B and understand what modifier is feeding those, and then you can make different things happen over time. And you can change things like FM or frequency on oscillators, or just whatever you can think of, depending on what modules you have open at that time. So it's really, really cool stuff. And I think it's super useful to understand the difference between those two types of signal paths. You have your audio signal paths. That's what is creating the actual sound that you're hearing. And then you have your modulation signal paths. That is what is controlling the sound that you're hearing in various ways. And it really just depends on what you're talking about. So these in particular are envelopes. You could have something like an LFO in here that is also a modifier, more of a modulation source. It can be used as an oscillator in different ways, but it's mostly used as a modulation source, because it's a very useful to basically wiggle knobs in different ways. You know what I mean? I mean, you can imagine wanting to, when you put your hands on a knob and you hear some sound that you like, you can imagine wanting to wiggle that knob again in some of the same ways, and maybe setting it up to be modified via the modulation source would be something that's really useful, because then it could be something that's musical, or just, to your taste, and you're not actually having to put your hand on it to do it. I mean, in a way, you're having to program it, but this is like setting up a system of rules to behave whatever way you want. So it's all about getting in here and basically getting creative and thinking about what you want it to do, so it can do all sorts of stuff. So really, really cool. Really, really cool stuff. So again, you have your audio signal paths and you have your modulation signal paths. And it's going to be really helpful as we move forward to understand the very important difference between those two things. I think in one of these upcoming Sunday Fundays, we will probably build a synth from the ground up, because that is always helpful to do. And it's always nice to not open up something that's familiar, and open up something that's that you're familiar with. And when you start dealing with things that are predictable, you tend to have the same sounds all the time. And that's the power of reactors. There's so many different things available that, you never know what door you're not opening unless you open it. So that's, I think, what we're going to do with one of these next videos. And I think that is that's all we're going to do. So have a good one.